Our prophecy spotlight today is one that we're probably going to be touching back on several times. This really kind of is an introduction to this topic because this is something that we're going to see apply more and more today. So as we go back, we're not going to be looking at something that has happened even this last year, this week, or this month, but actually something that happened a couple years ago. And this was the legislation of same-sex marriage. On Obergefell versus Hodges, it was a landmark civil rights case in which the United States Supreme Court ruled that the fundamental right to marry is guaranteed to same-sex couples by both the Due Process Clause and the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment to the United States Constitution in a 5-4 decision. So it was very close. And why this was significant was because up until this point, individual states could make the decision themselves through a legal process. The will of the people would be the will of the state, and certain states allowed for same-sex marriage, and some states did not. And so why this was significant was because the Supreme Court basically imposed this law onto all the states that did not want this to be the case in their states. And it's significant because the job of the Supreme Court is to interpret law that has already been established through the legislative process, through the democratic process. That way the people have a voice in what laws are put into place. They decide on its constitutionality. But in this case, some would say that they overstepped their bounds by imposing a law that was not democratically decided by the states and by the people. And so this was quite significant. And so we see this in play with same-sex marriage. How is this going to apply in future laws? Is the Supreme Court going to step in and decide what a law is going to be without going through the proper process? And so we will begin to see that. President Barack Obama, just as the Pope was leaving the United States and flying back to Rome, he made this statement at an LGBT fundraiser. He says, "We affirm that we cherish our religious freedom and are profoundly respectful of religious traditions." So that sounds nice. But he goes on to say, "But we also have to say clearly that our religious freedom doesn't grant us the freedom to deny our fellow Americans their constitutional rights." Now, this may sound okay until the laws that are being imposed are no longer the will of the people or are no longer constitutional. But when the Supreme Court decides that it's constitutional, then it falls underneath that statement. Then we can no longer, as those who are advocates of religious freedom, speak up and say and do contrary to what these laws that the Supreme Court has decided on. Chief Justice John Roberts, he says, and I want you to pay attention to these statements that he says. This was in his dissenting statement when this was being decided. He was of the group of 4 that had decided to vote no. He says, "Respect for sincere religious conviction has led voters and legislators in every state that has adopted same-sex marriage democratically to include accommodations for religious practice." So in other words, in the states that this was allowed in, say California, for example, they were able to accommodate those that were against it and protect those and protect religious freedom. You understand? So in other words, and you started to see this start to break apart, but those laws were able to be put in place, and those that were against it were able to be protective under these accommodations. But as he goes on to say, he says, the majority's decision, now this was the decision of the Supreme Court, the 5 that had voted in favor of it. They were the majority. He says the decision imposing same-sex marriage cannot, of course, create any such accommodations. In other words, the Supreme Court's decision cannot place accommodations protecting religious freedom and religious free speech. They can't protect it anymore. The way that this law was imposed on the states, that cannot be the case. And he goes on to say, he says, the majority graciously suggests that religious believers may continue to advocate and teach their views of marriage. The First Amendment guarantees, however, the freedom to do what? Exercise religion. So in other words, you can teach it, you can be an advocate for it all you want, but now that this has been put into place, you can no longer freely exercise. You can't. Ominously, that is not a word that the majority uses. The freedom to exercise your freedom of religion. It's being stripped away. Justice Clarence Thomas says, "In our society, marriage is not simply a governmental institution. It is a religious institution as well. Today's decision might change the former, but it cannot change the latter. It appears all but inevitable that the two will come into conflict. What happens when churches who hold a certain tax-exempt status refuses to violate their conscience and allow for same-sex marriage to take place in their church? What happens? They will lose their status. They can no longer freely exercise their freedom of religion. You can teach it all you want, but you're going to lose your status. You're going to lose that tax-exempt status, and you may have to pay all those back taxes throughout the year that you have been exempt from it. And you will start to see religious and especially Adventist institutions begin to be shut down. That's exactly what has happened here. Great Controversy, page 442, says the lamb-like horns and dragon voice of the symbol point to a striking contradiction between the professions and the practice of the nation thus represented. That was the United States. The speaking of the nation is the action of its legislative and what else? Judicial authorities. Does it say executive branch, executive authorities on there? It doesn't. How many times have you heard, we're waiting for the time that a president comes into office and enacts such and such laws. And those are the laws that we're fearful of. We're waiting for a president to come in and put that Sunday law into place. That's not the way it's going to happen. It's going to happen through its legislative and judicial authorities. In this case, it was the judicial authorities that decided what the law was going to be for states that were opposed to it. That's how it's going to happen. By such action, it will give the lie to those liberal and peaceful principles which it has put forth as the foundation of its policy. So this is just an introduction to this, because we are going to start to see that conflict now between church and state. And we're going to be able to report on those and show you exactly what was the consequence of this decision. And these Supreme Court justices knew exactly what the consequence was going to be, and they decided to do this anyways. And why this is so important is because the marriage, when was the marriage put into place? When did God design for the marriage to take place between a man and a woman? It was in the Garden of Eden, right? It was at creation. But there was one other institution that was put into place at that time. What was that? That was the Sabbath. The Sabbath and the family are twin institutions. Education, page 250, says the Sabbath and the family were alike instituted in Eden. And in God's purpose, they are what? Indissolubly linked together. So goes one, there goes the other. Marriage has already been taken away by our government. The freedom of religion in that case has already been stripped from us. So that one goes out the window. Where do you think the Sabbath is going to go? It's going to follow right with it. Indissolubly linked together. You cannot separate it. And so that is why it's timely that our message today is going to be on the Sabbath, and why it is that we need to cling to the truths that God has given us. And regardless of the persecution that the world will start to rally around those that oppose this and oppose the separation of God's law, we're going to need to be able to stand up to truth, regardless of what happens. Amen? Amen.